Hi there, Erin. I want to welcome you to this discussion. You're one of our speakers at the Evolve Leadership Summit that we're having in November of 2025 in the Canadian Rockies. We're so pleased that you're going to be spending time with our guests and sharing the knowledge that you have and the experience. You've got a lot of great experience in creating great work cultures that are inclusive. One of the things we're really excited to hear from you is about the different generations that we have. There's lots of talk about generational differences, but you really talk about the generational strengths and how we can collectively bring all those together to create a great work environment and actually be future ready. So welcome, and I'm pleased to be having this discussion with you, and we'll be sharing it with people who are looking at the summit.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm excited to have this conversation. I'm excited to share time with you and everyone in the mountains and talk about something that I think we often hear a lot about, but don't necessarily spend time understanding the nuances. And rather than thinking about it as a difference, how can we utilize it to our advantage? How can we start to understand the power of diversity and that dimension being those different generations that are in the workplace?
Exactly. So just kind of off the top, what inspired you to become part of our summit when we talked to you initially?
Well, the number one thing when I thought back to our initial conversation is throughout my career, I've always been obsessed with learning about leadership and how does that show up not only in myself and how have I evolved as a leader, but truly how can you really start to understand that when we have great leaders inside of organizations, we have great organizations. That is just a differentiator that is within our control, but we have to spend time on it. And so to know that you're going to be spending time in the mountains with leaders, how do they hone in on their skills to be a part of that and be part of the conversation always makes me really excited.
That's great. Thank you. We're so excited to have you part of it too. So in the circles that you're working in, that you're networking in, what does leadership look like in the people that you're talking to right now?
Well, that's a really good question. I think the obvious answer in what we've contextualized and had to work through as leaders in the last several years is how are we resilient? We hear this a lot because my past self spent a lot of time doing strategic planning. And in that process, leaders spend a lot of time thinking about what's the future for our organization going to be like. And you try to plan for it. You try to think about all of these different variables that are part of that output and how can we control that. But we know in a world of uncertainty, we sit here having this conversation in Canada, and there's a lot of geopolitical concerns within the marketplace. And so, how do we become resilient to work through that? And how can we understand how our leadership actually needs to be pretty steady during these periods of time because we have employees who are going to be asking questions of us and wondering what's next. What does this mean for the organization? What does this mean for my job? And as a leader, I don't think it means you need to always have the exact answer, but you need to have the ability to adapt and understand that everything's constantly changing.
Yeah, we can't expect that's ever going to be any different. So it's the adaptability, but also systemically thinking about what are all the connected parts. But I like what you said about how leaders are the ones that people look to. I mean, they look to us for strength, they look to us for some direction. But you're right, we don't always have to have the answers, but we still need to show up and be that strength and show that we're helping to figure it out. So what are some of the shifts or challenges that the leaders that you're working with day to day, what are they facing right now that kind of takes away sometimes from that strategic foresight?
I actually think this is part of what's so great about coming together to focus on your leadership for 2 days. I don't think people are challenged to say, oh, I need to be a thoughtful leader. I need to spend time leading. I can't just always be doing the tactical pieces of my work. We hear that all the time. But it's how does this become a reality? And how do we take the theory and apply it in real life circumstances? So, an example that often comes to mind, and maybe it's a bit overused, but it will be one that I will continue to advocate for, is when we create flexible workplaces. And as a practitioner of inclusion and someone who really focuses on how do we create the best working environments for employees, how are we doing that beyond the physical space? And I think in theory, if we had a conversation with leaders, they would say, of course, we need to be flexible. We need to allow our employees the space to do their best work. And we're talking about this in the context of a job that can be done in front of a computer, that can be done remotely, that has that type of flexibility. But when it comes to reality, are we enabling the way we would do work to allow people that flexibility to be able to work from home, to be able to maybe shift their working hours because they're new parents, or that they have elder care requirements in their life and that their day has to be flexible to that. So it's going beyond the surface and saying, okay, yes, we want to create these environments. How do we create these environments, and how are we measuring success? Because if we're measuring success simply by the time spent doing our work, are we really looking at productivity in the fullest sense? So someone's 8 hours in front of a computer might yield a certain amount of output. Someone's 4 hours of dedicated time at home might yield the same amount of output. And who are we to say there's only one formula, one way of doing things? So it's taking these concepts and actually working through some case studies, which is what we will do when we come together, and saying, how would I as a leader show up in this circumstance? And maybe I have had this circumstance before and I didn't really show up in my best way. What do I need to help evolve my thinking?
And I also think you've talked about this before. What are the optics of some of the decisions we make as leaders in those realms, and to different people who contribute in different ways? And so if we're sticking to the standard status quo, what kind of messaging is that giving people and their choices to actually stick with our organizations and grow with us or not?
Totally. And I think a term that comes up quite often is one of fairness. Our definition might be centered on fairness means equal, but we know when we think about diversity in the workplace, that means people work in different ways, that we may not be able to create that equity for them in the same way. That we have to really start to understand everyone's joining from a different playing field. Everyone has access to different tools, resources, abilities, and how are we as leaders adapting to those different types of work?
Right. And making the most of the strengths that they bring in those different types of work.
Totally.
So, one of the things I love about you is you're great at sparking conversation. In the times that we have met, there's so much to talk about because you bring in these thoughts and these ideas that really merit some good discussion. So with your involvement at the summit, what kind of conversation are you hoping is going to be sparked in the room between people when they hear what you have to share?
The one that comes to mind first is around how can we utilize everyone's lived experience. And what I mean by that, when we think about different generations in the workplace, we may have some biases that show up in terms of if we are of this generation, we work a certain way, our work ethic is defined by these specific categories, we are knowledge keepers in our field. However, we start to think about that and we place this broad stroke across a group of people. But are we forgetting the attributes of other generations and how that actually can help us? And a term that might be familiar to some is reverse mentorship. And this idea of not only can I learn from someone who has been in their career for longer than I have, but how can I also learn from those who haven't been in their career as long? They're experiencing this system potentially for the very first time. And so within that system, they're probably making observations. This maybe doesn't work the way that it used to work. Amazing. Let's think about how we can integrate that or make some changes in our organization. And someone who has a lot of built experience, how are they sharing their knowledge and having that become part of the mix of how we're making decisions? So it's just another way, another dimension of diversity to look at. And maybe we can start to use some different language. So this idea of lived experience and how it's all important to getting the best and innovative and creative outcomes rather than getting stuck on, oh, well, so-and-so's of a different generation, so
Right.
I will never understand them. And this is coming from me being a parent who has two little individuals at home who are of a different generation than myself, obviously. And so they are my greatest teachers. It's how I try to stay relevant to understand the younger generations, because no longer am I the newest person coming into the organization, right? I'm far from that.
I love that because I also find having to stay open. I find the rooms that I'm in, everyone's younger and younger as leaders, which is really exciting. But just to stay open that there is some possibility, because otherwise we can take it as their ideas for change and innovation looks like what we're doing isn't good enough or wrong. And it's not that at all. They just see possibilities in a different way. And it can be very exciting if we let ourselves go there. What's one shift or insight that you're hoping someone will take back with them coming to the summit and by hearing you speak?
When I look at the work that I do, it becomes very centered, at least at the early stages, around who am I? What type of leader am I? What type of leader would I like to be? And what's within my control? And in a world that is so busy, that has so many frameworks, has so many different approaches, how do I navigate all of that noise? The one thing that's always within our control is how we show up. What is our sphere of influence? And taking it back to that, because then it makes it seem less overwhelming. It's never the place for us to say, oh, well, you're doing it wrong. Everyone's showing up. They are trying to do their best. We want to take that as the baseline. And from that baseline, how can we start to ladder up and build some additional skills? So people will often say maybe it's the softer skills that I spend more of my time on. I think the technical pieces, we can go online, we can learn that, we can learn it in a classroom. But the softer skills, the human component, the part that AI will never take over, is the part that we can focus in on and start to understand how can I show up in a little bit more refined way. How, when I know better, I can do better, right? And so that's what I'm hoping for leaders, without sort of giving away all of the conversation, is saying, okay, how can I look inward? And how can I start to think about, when I'm entering a difficult conversation, how do I enter it with humility, knowing that the person that I'm engaging in this dialogue with, they're not there with ill intent. They are there to do their best. So how am I as a leader enabling them to do their best and hearing the nuances within their story, hearing the challenges that they may be facing? Because at the end of the day, being a leader comes with great responsibilities.
It does.
And so I hope people don't enter into that lightly. It is a place of great opportunity as well, where you get to help to support someone. But at the core of it for me, and where we will start in the journey and what I want them to take away, is what am I going to look at differently in my leadership? It's not anyone else's fault. It's not anyone else's actions that are causing the outcomes that I'm not showing up in my best way. There's ownership that we can take within our own leadership journey.
And that's perfect, because the reason we wanted to have you there is our audience, leaders who lead leaders, and they're the ones who are shouldering that responsibility, and the ones who are modeling the behaviors and choosing the words that actually are going to either help people feel included and like they belong and that there's a space for them, or not. And sometimes those are not so obvious. They're words and actions that we've used or that were modeled for us from previous leaders that we carry forward. But you're right, it's taking a look like what's working and what's not, and is it authentic with the leader that I want to be? So that's perfect for the people we'll have there.
Yeah. You make me think about the fact too that what is our reliable source of information, right? That's where unconscious bias comes from, right? It's based on our own lived experience. It's the leaders that we reported to. I'm fairly confident if we ask someone for, tell me an example of not great leadership, people would be very willing to share more than one story with us, right? They know what it isn't, but can they share the stories of what is great about leadership? And those might be harder to capture all the time, maybe, but the bottom line across all of that is, how do those leaders make us feel? We may not remember what they did or what they said, but they will always, Maya Angelou says, you will remember how they made us feel. And so back to me spending time in the softer skills, or these heart-based leadership skills, I like to refer to them as, actually make a difference. It's what carries those stories of great leadership across different individuals that we spend time with.
Well, and I would go even further to say that it's those skills that actually bring forward all that great technical genius. Because, as an example, you can't build a spaceship with the smartest people if people aren't getting along, they're not communicating, right? So all that skill and intellect is there, but you can't harness it. You can't use it for the things you're trying to achieve that are going to make everyone feel really proud without those other essential non-technical skills. Yeah.
Totally. And there's a story that lots of people know the unfortunate outcome from. So I shouldn't say that it's a great story, but it's a very good example of when we don't have those softer skills. And in this story, I often refer to the psychological safety of saying, yes, beyond the technical, how can I bring forward a concern that I have? And so this is the case study of the Challenger mission. And there was not psychological safety around the O-ring that the engineers were able to bring forward to say, actually, we do not feel that this is going to be a successful mission. And so everyone kept pushing forward to the deadline because that was the one metric that was being focused on. And
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, we had a really negative outcome from that. So for leaders to think about, there can be pretty big consequences to us not really leaning in and creating that environment for people to be able to communicate well, to say, actually, I don't necessarily agree with that. Or maybe we need to
Mm-hmm.
spend a little bit more time on that because we can be driven toward a deadline, a result, and miss these other components of what's going to make it a really great and impactful project.
And people to change that situation are the leaders, which is why, we're going to be having those discussions and sparking the conversations between attendees as well, so that they can start to lean into that.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. So just, in terms of wrap up, is there a leadership principle or mindset that you're really leaning into, or that you're very passionate about talking about these days?
The one that I always come back to is one of curiosity. And how can we as leaders know that there's always place for us to learn and to grow? And there's many opportunities to do so. I think that we can't become complacent in how we look at how we show up every single day. And when I have conversations with folks and I focus in the area of diversity, there are so many things that I don't know, and I've been in this space for almost 20 years doing the knowledge build, trying to understand different perspectives. There's no way that I know it all, but if I'm always curious to go beyond the algorithm of what is the information that's flowing to me that feels natural because that's what I have been interested in, and how can I be curious to learn something different, something new? A great example that I think a lot of Canadians can relate to is around truth and reconciliation. 10 years ago, we weren't having this conversation. We weren't trying to understand what is our history as Canadians. And now we are in a place where we are actively talking about truth and reconciliation. We are actively talking about Indigenous peoples and their contribution to Canada, to the leadership of this country. There's so much to learn in Indigenous values. And so that's an evolution of being curious, wanting to understand more, showing up with curiosity and saying, maybe there's more. Maybe there's something. And I challenge people to think about in the space of Indigenous values. More time is built on relations. Maybe our word that you and I are probably very comfortable with is, how are we building trust? How are we building relations? Because when we have that relationship, we have that foundation, I think it's a lot easier to move forward with our work, with whatever we're
Mm-hmm.
trying to accomplish. But if we don't know each other, we don't know those nuances of what makes us tick, then it makes it a little bit harder because our biggest frame of reference is ourselves. And that might be very different from the person that we are working with. So,
Mm-hmm. And it's so
curiosity.
relevant, because we're going to be talking about the future and what takes to lead into the future, and the kinds of skills and foresight we need to have in order to do that well. And when you have that trust, then you can help the group collectively go beyond their comfort zone, even, and to achieve great things that they can be very proud of. But you need that trust there to be able to pull all those skills and that motivation, and develop that intrinsic motivation in people to grow and go forward with you.
Mhm.
So you've got lots more to share. Every
Mhm.
conversation we've had, there's so much more. And so I'm really glad that you'll be joining us at the summit. And also, what I know about speaking with you is what you have to say is really tangible. And as a senior leader myself, you've really changed the way I think about things and think about my team, and how I give them room to be able to bring in their unique talents and gifts. So I appreciate that. And I look forward to learning a lot more from you as well, come November, when we actually have the summit. So thank you for being here with me today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And you're right, this is only just the beginning. Of course, we could talk for hours. I'm really looking forward to meeting everyone and diving deeper and giving them some really tangible pieces that they can walk away and bring into their leadership journey.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.